Yes, and equally quite a lot as well.
We'll wait a bit for everyone to join from the waiting room. Okay, perfect. So hello everyone and welcome to now it's the third day of the Girls Human Rights Hub Virtual Work Experience program. Thank you again for joining this program and for being today and this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are, with us at Girls Human Rights Hub with Coline Schupfer Galia and my co-moderator Safia. Today we're joining for the advocacy and campaign session, and we're doing a focus on legal advocacy and public awareness campaigns. Thank you very much for joining for this session, and I hand it over to Safi to do the introduction of our expert. Thank you, Coline, for joining us.
Hi, I'm Safi, and I'll be saying a bit about Coline. So, she is a senior legal officer with SR Lab Collaborative Research Centre for Resilience. For the past 10 years, she has engaged in advocacy, action research, and policy work, and has helped build structural legal aid projects in several countries across Asia, Europe, and North America. She previously worked and consulted for the Open Society Justice Initiative and the International Institute for Environment and Development, where she developed community-based public interest litigation and legal empowerment initiatives to strengthen protection regimes for migrants and refugees, and to seek accountability for the displacement and dispossession of Indigenous communities. She is the co-editor of the anthology Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence, Haymarket Books 2023, and has written on the subjects such as migration, displacement, human trafficking, and international law for the Borders Criminologies blog, Opinio Juris, and the Asia Pacific Journal on Human Rights and the Law. She holds a MST from Oxford University and an LLB from Sheffield University. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much to Ivana and Safia and the entire team. It's been so I've had the pleasure of being part of the Girls Human Rights Hub for a few years now, and I'm really thrilled to be leading this training session today. And just to start, I've structured it today in 3 parts, and I look forward to receiving your questions at the end. So first, we'll explore what girls advocacy actually means. Then we'll dive into legal advocacy, and I'll speak a bit about my personal journey from working on legal aid and refugee rights to working on borders and issues of power, tech, and justice. And finally, we'll talk about campaign strategy, how to build and craft a campaign for social justice. So what do we mean by advocacy for girls' rights? So essentially, girls' rights cover the fundamental human rights that respond to the unique challenges and barriers girls face because of their age, their gender, and other intersecting identities. And when you search for the main international legal frameworks protecting girls' rights, 2 big ones come up. The first is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, and the second is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, also called the CEDAW. And these treaties are really important. They set out in broad and general terms and give us a legal foundations to work with. And CEDAW is particularly interesting because it describes discrimination quite broadly, and it requires both legal equality, so that's like, what's written in the law, and practical equality, what actually happens in real life. It also calls for temporary special measures, which specifically require action to tackle harmful stereotypes, which is huge, of course, for girls' rights work. And what's really valuable about CEDAW are its general recommendations, which are sort of detailed guides that address real-world barriers girls face. So, for example, General Recommendation 25 focuses on achieving actual substantive equality, while General Recommendation 19 and 35 specifically deal with gender-based violence. And we also have some regional instruments that fill some gaps, like the African Protocol on Women's Rights, which address issues around violence, economic rights, and intersectionality. And we'll come to intersectionality later. But that's the thing as well with these treaties, and which is really crucial actually for anyone doing advocacy work, which is that the CEDAW has historically held the dubious record of being one of the most heavily reserved treaties in the world, which really limits advocacy. And there's also another problematic dynamic where the CEDAW's existence actually allowed other human rights bodies to continue neglecting women's rights. And it created what academics have called a kind of ghettoization, where women's issues got siloed off instead of being integrated everywhere. So there have been efforts for many, many years now, which is known as gender mainstreaming, but it's been an ongoing battle. But for the purposes of today, the bottom line is very much this, is that while these treaties are absolutely essential and critical foundations for our work, I want us to look at them as only a starting point. And this brings me to something I want to explore with you today, which is sort of the invisible architectures and how invisible architectures of bias actually work and why understanding them is so crucial for effective advocacy. So I want to come to a book. It's called Invisible Women. It's a few years old now, but I still like to come back to it because it makes a really, really crucial point. So in her book Invisible Women, Coline Schupfer Galia, could we have the next slide, please? Sorry. So that's the cover of the book. In this book, she digs deep into data to reveal how the world around us has been designed with men as the default, and how this gender data gap creates systemic bias that harms everyone. And what I love about this book is that she shows that this bias isn't just academic or theoretical, but she really digs into the data to show how it has sometimes life or death consequences. So one example from the book is that women are more likely to be seriously injured in car crashes because the crash test dummies are designed based on the average male body, or how in medical research, women are more likely to be misdiagnosed after heart attacks because their symptoms differ to those of men. And it also translates to everyday technologies, from the way smartphones fit men's hand sizes better to voice recognition software that struggle with women's voices, which creates obstacles for half of the world's population. And these issues really add up, because they cause billions of lost hours of productivity, higher healthcare costs, and lower safety for entire communities. So when advocating for girls' rights, the first big lesson I want us to take from this book and in general is that we need to look at the entire panoply of rights and how it impacts us and how we can use them to make the world fairer. Because if we want to really advocate for women's and girls' rights, we can't stop at international treaties like CRC and CEDAW, which are important foundations, but they're part of just a much, much bigger puzzle. And if we want to engage in advocacy and legal advocacy, we need to look at the invisible architectures and the barriers that girls face, which are hidden in the everyday systems that shape our lives. So this includes health systems, education, economic policy, tech, all of which interact with the law in complicated ways that can reinforce patterns of discrimination and invisibility. So as we think about these systems, and we'll get to some systems thinking later, I want you to ask, questions around, who's considered default in health research and policy or product development, and whose labor, paid or unpaid, gets measured and valued by economic models, and whose experiences, bodies, and perspectives are actually seen as the norm or even taken into account. So let's take technology, for example, because where it's increasingly becoming a bigger part of our lives, and the very data that powers our digital world today is not neutral. and it often reflects the invisibility of girls and women. So, we have algorithms that power school admissions and medical diagnoses that have, built-in gender biases. And all of this shows how the technology world, has this bias baked into it. And I think another, as I think I already made the point, but like data is never neutral. And when algorithms are trained on mostly male default data, they end up reinforcing and even amplifying existing inequalities. And this bias shows up in hiring decisions, loan approvals, and so on. And another, statistic actually from the book is the last one on there, which is that, women do about 75% of unpaid work, but economic models largely ignore this. So when policies and technologies on those models end up undervaluing women's real contributions to society, that has a really profound impact around, opportunity and like how people's work and people as people are valued. So there was a study recently that was done by a technical university in Germany on ChatGPT, which found, and could we come to, yeah, thank you so much, which was advising women actually to ask for lower salaries than men. So the researchers examined a number of things and how these models kind of offered career guidance, how they gave advice on goal setting and on behavioral advice. In every case, the large language model gave different responses depending on the user's gender, even when the qualifications and the prompts were exactly the same. So when we were thinking about girls and women's rights, I really want us to see the full picture. We must interrogate not only the letter of the law, but the everyday structures, data collection, tech, media, economic policy that make girls and women invisible or second tier by default. And I also want us to expand our approach because advocacy must call out the hidden architectures that shape our lives, whose bodies are considered standards, whose unpaid labor is counted. So I want us to ask not just if legal rights exist for girls, because of course they do, but also whose realities those rights actually reflect and who remains invisible when our data, our policies, and our tech fail to include everyone. So, and I want to come now to the last section of, this first part to look at a really important principle, which is intersectionality. So when advocating for rights, it's crucial to make sure we're including everyone. And the concept of intersectionality, which was one coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, shows us how systems like racism, patriarchy, and class combine to create layered inequalities shaping women's experiences. So intersection is a bit of a complicated word, but I think it's becoming more and more used now, which is amazing. But it's an important word because it's a word that makes us recognize that people face discrimination differently depending on various factors. And this of course includes sexual orientation and gender identity, but it also includes like where you live. So if you live rurally or urban, if you live in a country where there are opportunities or in a country where opportunities are limited, it takes into account disability, socioeconomic background, and of course like race, ethnicity, and religion, and legal status as well. So intersectionality is, in my opinion, a must when thinking about legal advocacy because it's a way to analyze inequality and a method to understand discrimination and human rights violations through the lens of overlapping experiences and power structures. So since Crenshaw has introduced this word, intersectionality has become a key framework in international human rights work, increasingly so, and because it helps us really understand, and uncover forms of oppression that might otherwise be invisibilized. And by applying this, and we'll come later to, intersectional analysis, we can really see how, how the world around us is actually shaped by so many factors and how discrimination doesn't exist in a vacuum and how bias is incredibly complex and shaped by like many, many overlapping factors. So for example, a girl with disability might face barriers not only because of gender bias, but also because she might struggle to access education or healthcare in a way that, girls without disabilities don't. In the same way, girls living in poverty might deal with gender discrimination, But this is made worse through, economic hardship, which limits their opportunity for education, for nutrition, for safety. So this all comes down to saying that, when we look at gender, we can't just look at gender. Our advocacy needs to be intersectional, and it needs to be, and because it's the only way to produce results that are fair, lasting, and effective, and actually takes everyone to account. So to bring the concept of intersectionality to life, I'd like to share a short video by Professor Crenshaw herself, the scholar who coined this term, in which she gives us sort of a very practical example and explains why intersectionality is so critical to advocacy.
Ago,
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Perfect.
I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. Emma de Graffenried was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired. And she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African-American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African-American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African-American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
Thank you. It's just a short clip, but if you want to dive further into it, there's a lot by Professor Crenshaw all over the internet. But I really like this clip because she really underscored the key example really, which is, how another example of intersectionality and how Black women don't just experience sexism or racism separately, but they're affected by both of it at once. And another thing that she said that I think was really important is about, you need to name a problem to be able to solve it. And when we go to the campaign strategy later, the first part is very much identifying what the problem is and naming it as a groundwork to build your effective campaign. And we're also going to come back to intersectionality later. But for now, I would like us to look more closely at what legal advocacy means and how mobilizing the law together with public campaigns can become tools for driving real change. So traditionally, when we talk about legal advocacy, many people think of lawyers arguing in court, filing lawsuits, and using legislation to right wrongs. And this is a big part of it. But the truth is, legal advocacy is much broader. So it's not just about what happens inside the courtroom. That's really important too, but it also includes everything that happens before and after litigation, both inside and outside the courtrooms. So it can mean, writing amicus briefs or policy paper, but it can just as powerfully mean teaching communities about their rights and then, how to claim them. And it can also mean, drafting more inclusive and equitable laws and even, supporting or organizing direct actions or public campaigns. So to make this a bit more concrete, I want to share a bit about my personal journey into this work and to illustrate the different forms of that legal advocacy can take. So in terms of a bit of a background, so I graduated law school in 2015. That year, as many of you might recall, was marked by an enormous influx of refugees fleeing conflicts, especially the war in Syria. And this was a time of immense, displacement and hardship. But just before my last year of law school, I spent the summer traveling along the Syrian-Turkish border. And I was trying to go to tobacco factories at the border for a photo reporting project, but never made it. And instead, I ended up traveling along the border towns from Hatay to Sanliurfa, to Van and Tatvan, which has a big Kurdish population, and meeting and speaking with folks who've crossed over into Turkey to rest before heading back to Syria. And the stories there I heard were, of family separation, of loss, of survival, uncertainty, which had a really profound impact on me and really politicized me in a way that, cemented my commitment to dedicate my career to human rights. And while I was passionate about continuing to work directly in refugee rights and protection, I also started to understand that, we were dealing with something much bigger and more systemic here. And that we, also needed to tackle the root causes that force people to flee their homes in the first place, whether that's conflict, climate change, arms trafficking, or other structural injustices that create displacement. But first come first, I had to go back to law school, and I was part of a student group that worked to raise awareness about the dire conditions faced by asylum seekers in our city, especially those that were destitute. So we really ramped up our work then and organized, campaign raising events, sleepouts in solidarity, music events to raise money, and brought together refugees and local residents in what we called Conversation Club, which was sort of a space of mutual exchange with tea and coffee and cookies, but it also doubled up as an opportunity for new arrivals to practice their English skills. And we also advocated and pushed for equal access to education for asylum seekers at our university. And this effort helped ultimately secure university scholarships for several asylum seekers. So you might ask, how is this legal advocacy? So even though we were not in court, we were using legal principles and rights to challenge discrimination, to build community solidarity, and to create change. And our campaign also engaged with systemic barriers, like the lack of educational access, which, of course, is grounded in law and policy. And we also educated both asylum seekers and locals about rights and equality, and advocated for policy changes based on those rights. So in many ways, this was advocacy rooted in law, but expressed through community engagement and public pressure. So later on, could we move on to the slides on Lesbos, please? Next one. Next one, please. So later on, I moved to Lesbos, and these are some pictures from the camp there. And Lesbos is an island off the coast of Turkey, where every day boatloads of people were arriving and fleeing war and violence. So in Lesbos, we offered free legal clinics, which were a form of legal empowerment. So not just providing legal advice, but helping people understand how to navigate complex systems themselves. So we provided individual one-to-one consultation sessions, and we ran information sessions where we'd break down the rights people actually had under international law, like the Refugee Convention, as well as under Greek national law. So these legal information sessions, and there's a slide where I show like one of the, the infographics that we used. These legal information sessions were designed to empower refugees by making them aware of their rights under international law. And they then went out to their communities and shared their knowledge about their rights and the procedures that had direct impacts on their lives. And at one instance, we also submitted a complaint to the EU Ombudsman about a local shop in Mytilene, which is the main town on Lesbos, that refused service to asylum seekers purely based on who they are. And the Ombudsman, it's a EU mechanism that exists, he acts as a watchdog, or she acts as a watchdog, to ensure fairness and accountability. And our complaint then kicked off a process where the Ombudsman actually looked into the case, asked questions, and pushed for a resolution. So again, here we're talking about some key advocacy strategies. First, we're directly educating people about their rights. And of course, you can't fight for something you don't know that it exists. Secondly, we were building capacity to use those rights, for people to use those rights themselves. So it's not enough to know that you have your rights on paper, you need to actually make them work in the real world. So in other words, you need to understand the procedures as well as, the law. Instead, it was, when individual empowerment wasn't enough, we were using formal complaint processes such as the EU Ombudsman to tackle discrimination at a systemic level. So, could we have this next slide, please? Thank you. So these activities that we were, that were from part of our work really demonstrate other, legal advocacy approaches that you can take outside the courtroom, which includes like directly educating individuals about their rights. Secondly, building the capacity of, individuals and entire communities to use those rights, to claim them. And finally, leveraging formal procedures to address systemic discrimination. And what's important to mention is that this whole approach works within existing legal systems, using what's already there to help individuals stand up for themselves, while also holding institutions accountable when they mess up. And this kind of legal advocacy works to create, both individual empowerment as well as institutional accountability. And could we have the next slide, please? So I now want to come to something that's called legal empowerment. And what you see on the screen now is the legal empowerment circle. So this circle on the left, the circle on the left captures what we were doing in Lesvos. So helping people to know and understand the law that apply to their specific situations. And on the right, you'll see it's the systemic change part, which is about helping people, have already, once they already are organized, to actually shift and shape the law. So after Lesvos, I moved to London to work with the Open Society Justice Initiative. And this transition really opened my eyes to how legal empowerment, the entire cycle, could work on a much broader systemic scale. So again, on the left, you have the grassroots work where people know the law and can use it effectively. And then you have, people shaping the law. So the real power happens when these two sides feed into each other, when people's lived experiences on the ground inform much bigger policy changes, and when new laws and policies actually, improve people's life on a daily basis in real and tangible ways. So at the Justice Initiative, I found an organization that had made, legal empowerment really central to everything they did. Because, what they essentially understood is that the law is something that's malleable. It's not a rigid, untouchable system, but something that's constantly evolving and that can be shaped, challenged, and improved through strategic action. And so this approach also means that, instead of creating dependency on legal experts, you're building power within communities. So, you're training paralegals, you're developing know your rights documents, similar to what we did at Lesvos, in, various local languages. You're also supporting community advocates and working with people on the ground to, document violations and push for accountability. And I think, I like to think of legal empowerment as a way of democratizing access to justice. And we know that, access to justice is such a difficult thing globally, but legal empowerment, I believe, is a way of, of getting there. Of breaking down the barriers that make, the law feel like something that happens to people rather than something that people can actively influence and use to improve their lives. So, that's the power of this empowerment cycle. It's not just about individual cases and policy events, which of course are important, but it's about sustainability and creating a sustainable system. So when I joined the Justice Initiative, I joined a team that was building work to support displaced Rohingya refugees in Asia. And so to provide a bit of context, could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So by 2017, there was over 1 million Rohingya, which were based in Cox's Bazar, which is a town in Bangladesh, right at the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar. And the United Nations at the time was calling the Rohingya the most persecuted minority in the world, because Myanmar had systemically persecuted Rohingya for decades, stripping them of citizenship and basic rights of land, alongside a huge dehumanization campaign within the country. So when the military junta launched a brutal campaign against Rohingya in 2017, hundreds of thousands fled across the border into Bangladesh in a matter of weeks. which was, obviously really complex because, Bangladesh was in a really tricky situation. They were suddenly hosting a massive population. They didn't have a legal framework for dealing with refugees. So while, when I was sitting in Lesbos, Greece is party to the 1951 Refugee Convention and the protocol and had asylum procedures in place. Bangladesh isn't party to this international treaty. They didn't have domestic refugee law or asylum procedures and no formal recognition system. And at the same time, it's, they were caught sort of between humanitarian obligations with this, with this new influx of people, as well with their own concerns. So Bangladesh, some of you will be familiar, it's a small country in South Asia that struggles significantly with overpopulation, high poverty rates, and is also predicted to lose 11% of its surface area by 2015 due to rising sea levels. So they were already missing, dealing with massive internal challenges around displacement of their own populations, and suddenly hosting over 1 million additional people, which put a huge strain on infrastructure services. And despite this, which I think is so admirable, they opened their borders anyway out of humanity. But legally speaking, the Rohingya that arrived were just in a limbo. They weren't officially refugees, they weren't citizens, they were just there. So the government at the time was providing sort of this temporary shelter system and basic services, but everything was framed sort of as a temporary humanitarian assistance, not rights-based protection. And the language really matters here because it really shapes what people can expect and demand. So when someone talks about humanitarian assistance, it can be, that can be something that can be withdrawn. And we saw this year with US aid, of course. But when you talk about something that's a right, you can advocate for it, you can fight for it in the courts, you can organize, you can hold governments accountable. So, this is where, you already had in Cox's Bazar local international groups providing services, but, there was this kind of growing recognition that we needed to move beyond just meeting immediate needs, especially because there was, no near-term solution to the displacement situation over there. So, we needed to, as an international community, to better understand what rights Rohingya communities actually had under existing laws, and without the formal refugee framework. And civil society was already asking hard questions. What legal protections exist? Can we use constitutional rights to cover, people in refugee-like situations like the Rohingya? And are there any administrative policies that could be leveraged? And these questions were really practical because it really influenced whether people had the right to work, whether Rohingya families could send their kids to school, access healthcare, and if they have any channels to seek protection from exploitation. And this is where we came in. So to answer these questions and to develop sort of and nurture a rights-based approach, we decided to map what legal protections actually existed within Bangladesh's domestic legal system and also under international laws and international treaties that Bangladesh was a party to. So we partnered with Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust, BLAST, as well as local lawyers who intimately understood the system and dove deep into constitutional law, labor laws, local governance structures. And what we found was really, really remarkable. So there were actually significant legal protections scattered throughout the system that could apply to non-citizens, including, Rohingya, displaced Rohingya in Bangladesh, and, other stateless populations too. So can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So on this slide, you see two reports. So the first report, Beyond Refuge, on the left, wasn't just research. It was sort of a tool for legal empowerment, which we made accessible to frontline workers, community paralegals, and local advocates. So what we were essentially saying in this report, was, look, Bangladesh's own laws require certain protections for non-citizens, and this is how we can hold these systems accountable to its own standards. And obviously, BLAST was really, really critical on the ground because they were embedded in the community. They were leading training the trainer sessions. And we also run a summer school to make sure that this resource, could be used in the hands of local advocates who would then be working in courts, many of them, using advocacy grounded in the protection notes from the report to advance rights and protections to secure remedies for, displaced Rohingya. And later on, we then expanded this approach regionally with the second report that you'll see there, Undoing Precarity, which looked across South and Southeast Asia. So we looked at India, Malaysia, Pakistan, Thailand, and Indonesia, all of who are, countries that were hosting Rohingya refugees. And in those countries, we again documented, positive practices for refugee protection that were already happening. And what's important to mention is none of these, countries are party to the Refugee Convention, but this didn't mean that they didn't have protection systems and, standards and laws in place. So through this exercise, we showed that, creative legal advocacy can be possible everywhere, not just in countries that, have subscribed to like the Refugee Convention and Protocol and other treaty bodies. And, the second report again became a resource for legal practitioners and activists working across the region to, offer concrete strategies for using, domestic laws and policies. So I think, what I want to demonstrate with this is that, you don't have to wait for the ideal legislation. Of course, like, that's advocacy in itself, but we can also work with what exists and push the boundaries of how norms are interpreted and applied. And what we're doing here, I think it's sort of, it does, going back to like the cycle of legal empowerment, this demonstrates legal empowerment. It demonstrates, where you have a situation where formal legal protections seemed absent, but you're still using the law as a tool for advocacy and change. So to summarize, our approach to legal advocacy in this case, could we have the next slide, please? It's about, helping local advocates, lawyers, and even government officials understand what legal options actually exist. The second one is around, working with communities and giving them the knowledge and tools to use these protections effectively, because, we know that you need to know your rights before you can claim them. And the third was about, it's systemic. It's about working to shift the narrative, from humanitarian responses to rights-based approaches, which really, really mattered because yeah, I think like even, like across the region, it was about changing sort of the perception that people had around Rohingya who've been, subject to a decades-long campaign of dehumanization. And through this work, we're showing that, you can find ways to use the law to expand rights, and build accountability, even in situations where it might not seem like that. So yeah, I think, we need to think of law as malleable, something that, can be interpreted and expanded and applied in different ways to serve justice. And we also need to find power within, existing systems to build knowledge and capacity within communities, and using that combination to sort of push for the recognition and protection of fundamental human rights, no matter, how challenging the political or legal landscape might be. So I want to go to, just some key takeaways that I want us to take from this. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So first of all, it's like, legal advocacy has to be multi-dimensional and intersectional. So it's not just about courts and cases, it also includes community education, strategic litigation, of course, but also policy reform, media campaigns, grassroots organizing, and most importantly, and I think, you can't do real advocacy without doing, intersectionality, because people's experiences are so different and are so grounded in overlapping, identities that we must take into account in every advocacy campaign. And also, the second one, it needs to be community-led. So the most powerful legal advocacy is rooted in lived realities, in the hardship as well as in the leadership of those affected. So we need to make sure that, legal strategies serve their goals, and it also means that, building people's capacity to claim and defend their own rights, because it's the only way that, change can actually be sustainable. And the last one is about, advocacy needs to be integrated advocacy is more powerful. Like legal work and, it's just one part of a holistic campaign that combines multiple tactics. And we'll come to like, different examples of tactics later on. And yeah, of course, litigation can open doors and, and build public pressure. But just as important as storytelling, as coalition building, as education. So, the work for like social justice work is long term and it's really iterative. So we can only grow this by, also, using integrated advocacy and also really importantly, sort of, celebrating small wins along the way. So now we've sort of laid the foundation, and now I want to come to, understanding how we can go about building legal advocacy and public awareness campaigns in the first place. So yeah, I think, going to the architecture of campaign building, I want us, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I want us to, think of campaign building a bit like constructing a house. So you need to understand the soil you're building on. You need to understand the weather patterns and know what kind of materials are suitable to the environment. And the design needs to also fit the communities that actually, fit the people that actually live in that community. And I think campaign design follows a similar logic. It's sort of systematic, but it's also creative and responsive to the unique challenges you're working on. So as we think of the architecture of campaign building, and I want to emphasize that, this is very iterative and depends very much on the situation, but I like to think of it in three phases as sort of a backbone, as a roadmap to kind of ensuring that, we don't miss any steps. So the first phase, which you'll see there, is problem analysis. So this is, getting clear essentially, what are we fighting for? And this is, where everything starts. And honestly, it's probably the phase that, you want to rush through because it can feel really abstract, but it's really important to be so clear on because, it will save you months of spinning the wheel later on if you don't really, go into the problem analysis. So, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So in this first phase, there's sort of like three critical steps that I would go about. So the first is, understanding, the problem through an intersectional lens. So, for example, if you're concerned about online harassment against women, which is obviously a massive issue that affects women and girls everywhere and deters them from like, entering positions of power and political spaces. All of this might seem like quite a straightforward problem on the surface, but actually, it's much deeper and it's important to apply an intersectional analysis and ask deeper questions. Are we talking here about all women or do certain groups face more severe harassment? What about, migrant women who face both misogynistic and xenophobic abuse, alongside sort of, gendered harassment? And what about, LGBTQI people who speak up publicly? What about, women with disabilities who might be targeted? So, this deeper analysis often reveals that what looks like one problem is actually several interconnected challenges that require different solutions. So, maybe, working class women who discuss economic struggles will face, class-based mockery alongside gender abuse, or maybe, you have an immigrant woman who's targeted, but, they weaponize both their gender and immigration status to silence them. So you can't design an effective campaign without understanding your constituency and also like these nuances, and the fact that platforms themselves may amplify the problem. So, and then there's, I'm going to go to, there's obviously goal setting. So goal setting is really, really important, but actually I recommend to do stakeholder mapping first because, you need to also understand the ecosystem around it. And this isn't just about, identifying your targets, but also understanding sort of like all the power play. So what I recommend is that, you're looking at, your primary target. So if you're trying to make the situation better for, your constituency, who actually has the power to make the changes you want? So it might be like, social media campaigns like Meta, TikTok, or X, or maybe it's government officials who are, responsible for online safety legislation. Or maybe it's like, law enforcement and, they need better training on digital abuse. And then it's also important to look at secondary targets, because the secondary targets are the people that influence your primary targets. So it could be, advertisers who don't want their brands associated with harassment. It could be, MPs who can raise these issues in parliament, or journalists who are, covering platform accountability, or that's actually something that's used quite a lot in people who work on corporate accountability. Is like it could be shareholders who are, concerned about reputational costs. And then what's really important, and we'll get to why it's important later on in tactics, is allies. Really understanding who's already on your side, who can you collaborate with. In this situation, it will probably be like women's rights organization, digital rights groups, anti-racism campaigners. Are they what's already being done, and where can you kind of join forces. And then there's also the opposition, which is especially it's really important these days with growing anti-rights globally. It's it's important to be here. I think understand opposition as active, so the people who are actively working against you. But it's also important to be honest about who actually benefits from keeping things as they are. Because often opposition, I think, can also include the passive, folks, people who don't want to deal with change, or platforms, this could be platforms themselves who, don't want to invest in better systems, or it could be officials who see this as not a priority for their policy. And then lastly, there's neutral parties, and this group is really, really important. And they're the people sometimes referred to as the movable middle, who could go either way. And they're really important audience because they're persuadable, and sometimes maybe this could be, for example, like the mainstream media. It could be tech workers who don't want who want to do the right thing, but haven't thought about intersectional approaches to safety, for example. And later on, when we come to how crafting a campaign, and you think through your different messages, it's really important to understand who are you targeting with that message, and tailor that message to that specific stakeholder group. And then finally, we'll go to goal setting. So the previous slide, thank you. So this is, there's very different ways. There's a smart approach to set goals. I like to think of it in a time scale. So which is, media goals, so it's things that, you can accomplish in a short term. So if it's about raising awareness around an issue, or where can you build momentum? Then there's the intermediate goals, which are really, really important, which is about, pushing for policy changes, or securing funding, and sort of having that medium, it's probably the thing that you'll be working towards on a day-to-day. And of course, there's dependencies to intermediate goals. So, if you say, for example, in 12 months, we will successfully advocate for a major social media platform, for example, Blue Sky, to implement harassment reporting systems, it might work, but there might be some resistance. But it could be a realistic goal actually within that time frame. And then there is sort of the long-term vision, which is a transformational goal, which is the systemic change that you actually want to see. And maybe 2 to 5 years is quite optimistic here, because it's taken movements much longer. But it's important to have that kind of blue sky thinking in mind, because it drives movements, and it drives us. And I think having that vision will bring a lot of energy to your daily work. So yeah, I think and for example, an example of a long-term vision could be making sure that online spaces are just safe for women. They can participate without fear of being targeted, or subjected to violence. Obviously, that's incredibly idealistic, but we need to work towards that, and visioning is so important. So next I want to get to strategy development. How do we actually get there? So this is where you move from understanding the problem to developing your theory of change. And your theory of change is essentially connecting the dots, between action and impact. So, and then tactics selection. So there's I listed a various there, but you can, there's limitless tactics that you can use. But based on your theory of change and your understanding of the political landscape and having then your stakeholder mapping and power analysis, you can choose the specific tools and tactics that might be suited. So it could be legal empowerment workshops, it could be documentation to build your evidence based, or coalition building to amplify your voice. It could also be strategic litigation. And yeah, it includes so many different possibilities that are listed there. And the key really is to choosing tactics that complement each other and that also match your capacity. And also when you do your stakeholder mapping and analyze who your allies are, it's also about identifying the gaps and understanding what's already being done and where it can we add value and power. And then the last one here is an important one that's really realistic, important, especially at the moment, is about thinking around timeline and resources. So what expertise what funding is a really important part of social justice work and campaigning at the moment. And it's important to understand that and be practical as well about funding. Like a few months ago, I transitioned to a small organization, and these questions are really practical. And it's better to do ultimately fewer things well than to spread yourself too thin. And yeah, going to the next slide, implementation. So this is where your campaign moves from strategy to concrete action. So every strategy needs to be broken down into specific tasks with clear deadlines. So, within your team, you're going to have to decide who's going to draft that policy brief, or who's going to be organizing that community meeting, who's going to manage media campaigns. And what's really important here, and it's also contingency planning, good advocacy, it's likely going to invite some backlash. So, it's really important to kind of think, what if your opposition will try to discredit your research? Maybe there's going to be some media coverage that's negative. Maybe community members will face retaliation for participating. So, for every risk, it's really important to make sure that you have a mitigation strategy in place. So this could be like creating security protocols for vulnerable participants, which is so critical, but it could also be around diversifying funding resources or preparing spokespeople within your organization to handle difficult interviews. And then the last point here is, it's about having mechanisms for evaluating and adapting and also celebrating small wins, because, no campaign goes exactly according to plan or to timeline, and that's really okay. But the key is to kind of building in regular check-ins where you assess, what's working, what isn't, and also what needs to change and what are we doing well. And maybe your messaging isn't resonating the way you expected, or maybe the political landscape is shifting. There's things that things like that you can't necessarily control, but the bottom line is that a good campaign is constantly learning and adapting to the situation it's in. So yeah, so we're almost at the end, and we're almost ready for the exercise and some questions. But I just want to make sure that we mention the messaging, because it needs to. In many ways, it determines your success and how well you communicate your issues. So your messaging needs to be clear, compelling, and really tailored to your audience. And you'll know your audience from your stakeholder analysis. And I really encourage that here you have a core message which very much captures the essence of what you're fighting for and why it matters. And it should be connected widely with values of fairness, safety, and opportunity. And your core message will be core to you, but you might tailor it to make sure that your audience understands it. And then what's really important with messaging, I think, adding evidence-based data. So similar to what Perez was doing in the book of Invisible Women, to being okay, this is our core message and this is a problem backed up by this data. Sometimes a personal story. And And ultimately, I think, what's really important in campaigning is making sure you're providing some solutions to and a call of action at the end. So, every piece of communication should tell people exactly what what you want them to do, like sign a petition, attend a meeting, or join an organization, call your representative. So yeah, I think don't just ask, for example, stand up against online harassment, because I think for a lot of people that would be too vague, but ask them to contact their local MPs or call out platforms, or move the engagement to platforms that actually respect the values that you stand for. So yeah, I'll stop there because I feel like we're very on time. And yeah, thank you for the space.
Thank you so much, Coline. It was indeed very professional from our part, and I hope the audience hasn't been how to say, not like the wealth of information. It was so big. So thank you so much for bringing that type of expertise to us. We're super thankful. So yeah, and I see that hello everyone, like you haven't made any questions. Perfect. Okay. So we have a couple on our side as well, but yeah, everyone, like if you have any questions, I know that the topic is new and could be a bit complicated, and Coline has had a wealth of experience working in advocacy and campaigning and legal advocacy. But like if you have any burning questions, please, this is a golden chance for you to ask her.
I perhaps take the question, the third one.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that question is really, really excellent. And look, I think, there's an understanding of law and legal advocacy that's very top down. But I think, what's increasingly changing, and I think that culture shift is still very much underway, is sort of understanding that, lawyers need to work in deep collaboration with social movements, leveraging sort of every legal hook possible to build collective power that's needed for transformative change, and when thinking about, this kind of lawyering, it's like, community leadership and accountability is really, really critical. And the lawyer who's working on a case might not necessarily be integrated in a community, but they need to collaborate with community leaders to kind of hear their voices and build advocacy that's aligned with their core messaging and essentially where they're getting from. And this, I think it's increasingly happening, and I see organizations, there's a whole movement called movement lawyering that's increasingly engaging with this kind of work, and it's sort of what, like, true meaningful transformative advocacy is about. It's about building power and creating, grounded in the leadership and the wisdom of the communities most affected by these issues. Because lawyers are not, like, they might be experts in the law, but they're not experts in, like, the social justice issue that's integrated here. And I think that's where also intersectional justice, that analysis works to break down that power dynamics as well, because it does understand that it's about shifting power, not holding and hoarding it.
So true. So Srilakshmi says, how do people who conduct advocacy ensure it doesn't feel overly influential? Is still congruent with the community. The priorities are obviously justice, but I've seen interviews where locals comment that legal advocacy or interventions can feel savor, which distract from the goal. How can this be avoided, mitigated to make legal interventions more effective?
So yeah, I think we're going back again to the deep collaborations with the social movements, and systems thinking, understanding intersectionality and understanding also that you are coming to the situation from a place of power as a lawyer often, and devolving that power to communities. So and developing, and there's something called like a helicopter approach in lawyering where lawyers zoom in and zoom out. But I think something like that can be mitigated through long-term relationships with communities and sort of, connecting individual cases to sort of broader systemic change and to kind of movement goals. And I think, when we think about legal advocacy, and I try to integrate those, considerations along the way around intersection analysis, around using sort of legal empowerment and thinking about legal advocacy holistically, through kind of that approach and like positioning, communities experts as their own experiences and giving them the platforms, you can mitigate a lot of the savory feelings. And making sure that, actually, like if you win something in court, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to create a change in the community. That's why you need legal empowerment. And that's something I really want to emphasize.
And if I can follow up, 10 years ago, I was part of a legal empowerment that I was part of a nonprofit that did free legal aid, but like alongside the legal part of going to the courts, they did legal empowerment, going to rural areas and talking about how the law on domestic violence and the measures and all the tools, that the mechanisms that the law had provided to them. It was a changed law at the moment. And I do understand, Shilajmi, like at the time, like I remember I was just a law student, just finishing fresh out of law school. And there was this misconception that, oh, these people, they will come to change, and like they are the saviors of this community who has had, I don't know, violence ingrained in their communities. But I do think it's this whole intersection. It goes by time, and is as much so like the more that these sessions were common in the communities, then this whole approach was, it's not anymore. I don't think so.
I think that's a really good example. That's why we need integrated advocacy. We need the people in the court, but we also need, the organizing and the community work.
We have a person asking, where did you work? So besides the Open Society Foundation, and now that you're working at, it looks very cool, by the way.
No, so now I work on it as a collaborative research center for resilience, and we work on bordering and migration justice and technology, focused mostly at the US-Mexican border. And the institute was that's it.
Amazing. We'll share the bio. It is part of the information on the website, but we'll share it also afterwards when we put the presentation of Coline's at the Mighty Network.
I think we've got another question from Sri Lakshmi. So the question is, well, first of all, she says she loves your earrings. So a follow-up question is, how can intersectional justice be carried out in countries that perhaps have a stronger barrier to one of the intersectional spectrum, like, for example, limited rights for LGBTQ people, but decent protections for women?
So obviously this is like incredibly context specific, but I want to go back to the example of Bangladesh. And I feel like, obviously if there's legislation that's criminalizing LGBTQ, there's a lot of legal advocacy that's needed to overcome that. And we've seen incredible legal advocacy. And actually you'll speak to Eleanor tomorrow as well, who's done some incredible work around the legal advocacy against FGM. So she'll speak more about that. So that's obviously critical, but I think, it's about also looking at the law and seeing that maybe we can actually, there's no protections for LGBTIQ people, but maybe there's other protections that we can, activate. So for example, like in the case of Bangladesh, when we looked at the constitution, it provided protections to everyone, regardless of their status, their citizenship, and so on. And we managed to, by virtue of that, apply it to the stateless population. So, there's other laws that we can activate within the constraints, but that's not, I don't want to, at the same time, it's really important. The law provides incredibly, necessary protections. So conducting legal advocacy that goes against the criminalization of certain identities needs to be a core part of that, response.
Okay, we've got another question from Sarah, sorry. So what are the key legal restraints we need to watch for when advocating on sensitive or controversial issues?
So key legal constraints, well, there's a lot. obviously there's like, backlash and pullback, but then depending on where you're working, you'll also get, culture and other, reasons that are surface. And actually, the way I like to approach this is by referring back to international human rights law, because I feel like it does provide us a basis that is applicable globally to kind of, to have sort of a baseline understanding, like everyone has human rights, there's human dignity. So I feel like, depending what the sensitive or controversial issues are, I think going back to human rights law and, basing your arguments and your reasoning based on like these internationally recognized, standards are like a way of responding.
Okay, and another one is, what would you deem the biggest challenge in aligning legal advocacy with the real grassroots, community-driven needs?
So I think there's a big culture shift that's needed in terms of, the way that power is hoarded and exercised and shared. Um, and it's often like, and there's actually another resistance that I see quite a lot is saying that, community work takes a lot of time. And it's true, it does. And so does social justice work takes a long time. So I feel like, this is one of the, challenges people don't want to commit because it's like, look, I don't have the time to do it. Or often like, funding. But I feel like, the wins at the end are so much more meaningful. And, if you do apply long-term thinking to your analysis, that you see that, all of the effort that you do in building community and building power in the community will come to shine.
Okay, and I think we've got a question or two for you as well.
Okay.
So we were wondering, what advice do you have for young people who also want to design campaigns on legal or digital rights issues?
So I would say like start where you are. Look around you. I'm sure, our world is becoming increasingly unequal. And I think, we also know that, women's and girls' rights are under attack globally. And we also know that, we're having to grapple with compounding challenges and forces posed by like climate change and technology. So I think like, it's important to start where you are. Find what really matters to you because, social justice struggles are long term. And being part of like a movement like it takes a long time to kind of build that up, so figure out what you really care about, and yeah, and start where you are.
Okay, and then final question from us. How can cross-sector collaboration, like for example, law, tech, education, and other various things, strengthen the advocacy of campaign, the future advocacy of campaigns?
Thank you, Sophia, so much for that question. And I think we go back here again to intersectionality, because like our lived realities are impacted by all these forces. Like, I use, because we work on technology, the way that, gender and like gender bias plays into that. So yeah, we need to work with, lawmakers, but we also need to work with, tech companies who actually have the power to implement those changes. And then on those that, actually exert power on them, which is like shareholders. So looking at all these different angles. And I also think cross movement is so important because it gives us additional arguments. And power, we have power from the masses. So for example, when we think around like, the impacts of tech also has, a huge, like, especially if you look at AI, because it's something that, has been like turned up in our lives in such a, abrasive way, is it has a huge impact on the climate. That's so devastating. Can we join up with the climate movement, which is very well organized in many ways? Yes, we can. And I think it'll make our own movement so much stronger. So that's just something I want to emphasize.
Thank you so much, Coline. And we are a bit behind the time, and this is the last question for the session from Shilakshmi. She says, as someone that works in the advocacy space, how do you deal with institutional setbacks? For example, the BBC look into sex trafficking in Kenya resulted in no arrest because the government didn't want to pursue it. How is that dealt with and overcome? Or like / overcome?
Yeah. Advocacy is hard. And there's going to be setbacks. Like if you look at the women's rights movement, there's been so many campaigners working all around the world to decriminalize abortion, LGBTQI, and now we're facing a new wave. But setbacks, I think, it should provide new momentum to reorganize. And yeah, maybe it might be, a lot of this is very political as well. It might be a change in the government that actually opens up new opportunities for advocacy, or, in this case, when there's just institutional setback, maybe, this opens a pathway to do some, advocacy at the UN level with special rapporteurs to kind of change or maybe you go more grassroots, because actually, what we often forget is that constituencies have power over, politics too. So maybe this is, where you have to, generate power within the people to actually, to talk about this and to apply pressure to, to seek accountability and to push for accountability.
And not to be bleak, but governments do change. So yes, thank you so much to everyone that did the questions. For everything else, I will share on the Mighty Network the profile of Coline and the presentation, and I'm pretty sure going back to it, it's going to be very, very helpful. Thank you, Coline, so very much for all the amazing contributions that you've had to this session. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a resource for everyone who would like to know more on the topic, to go back to review it, to watch it, to watch a recording, and to like go point by point to every word that you've said during this session. It has been so insightful, so informative for me, and I'm pretty sure like for everyone that has attended this session. Thank you for your time and for being a part of the Gross Human Rights Hub community and team.
Thank you so much for the space, and good luck with this week. We'll be in touch.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So thank you everyone once again. I hope you had a very good session, and yeah, we'll share the presentation, we'll share the recording. I am sure that it will be good to review it and watch it again at a slower pace. And now we're on time for our exercise. Now, I've shared the exercise on Canva on how we did it yesterday. I hope that we don't have any issues with members not getting access to Canva, but again, if anyone does not have access yet, please put your email address on the chat so I can add you immediately, or send an email to me at the admin@ghrh.org. And the task that will last around, wouldn't see 25 minutes or 30 minutes tops. We're a bit behind, so we're gonna see maybe on 25. So if we have some submissions, we're gonna start discussing your submissions at 11:45. So the task is to design a brief legal advocacy campaign, taking into mind everything that was said by Coline and everything that was presented. And you choose a legal issue, you define your advocacy, you identify your audience, your craft legal advocacy messages, and then potentially, optionally, you might name your campaign. These are the tasks and the steps. Hopefully they help you somehow. And yeah, and we can maybe talk about also the 3 phases of the campaigns and that Coline explained as well. It is up to you if you want to work it in a Word document or if you just want to put it here on the comments. And as we did yesterday, it'll be very good to hear a couple of you when we do the exercise. I'm going to leave this open. I'm going to close this so they don't have any issue with you. So yeah, let me see if we have any questions. Okay. Madeline, wait, let me sort this immediately. Just give me a moment. Lily, I think it's sorted. Let me know if the issue persists. Okay, do we have another Q&A? Another questions? Okay, we'll meet then at 11:45 to go through the exercise. Anyhow, even if you are not able to finish during the time, please put it there, and we're gonna ask Coline or a member of our team to go through them and make a comment on your campaigns. See you in 25 minutes. For anything that you might have, please put it on the comments below. Thank you. Okay, we can start in a minute. Aya, Imogen, Dilara, would any one of you want to speak out? Let me know on the chat box, please. If you'd like to say by voice your response. Perfect, Aya. Okay. Chicka, 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 chicka.
Hi, can you hear me, Ivana? Okay, so essentially how I went about this is I looked at abortion because I feel like it's such a relevant issue. And there's always this sense of like criminalization of like child survivors after they undergo like abortion procedures. I feel like especially in America as well, like sort of the South, like Texas. And then I just sort of looked at the first bit of my steps. I looked at how marginalized communities, especially sort of like tribes as well, like they're always maybe denied safe and legal abortion. And then this sort of leads them to sort of like fail to provide the adequate resources, them with like mental health or like even post-abortion support. And then when they do undergo abortion, it's always sort of they say they're seen as like used or like, you know, seen in such a negative light because it's not a traditional or cultural practice or way to go about things. So they're always looked down upon, and almost like they make them feel like they lose their value as a woman because they have been through such a traumatic experience. And then this kind of like leads them to almost criminalize this idea that if you do undergo abortion, if you do not go through with the pregnancy, that you are seen to be less of a woman or you are just not as like valued. And then this is why I think that like it's not just like a medical failure, but it's also like a human rights crisis, because the fact that these women in marginalized communities can't access such support and medical help is a human thing. It's not just a medical thing of just simply taking away the baby from the mother. And then looking at the legal advocacy goal, what I'd obviously want to do is to advocate for the decriminalization of abortion in all cases of child pregnancy specifically, and also to reform maybe national and also judicial protocols in countries that have maybe laws that don't protect women in cases of child pregnancy. And then this would obviously provide like the safe tools and also medical help, and also the mental health department to also help children that have undergone the procedure. And so this would include things such as training the health and justice personnel on the child sensitive care, because obviously children are a bit different to fully grown adults in when they do undergo this procedure. So just sort of having the right and catered and tailored care for these children, and also embedding intersectional protections for Indigenous and rural girls. So this would include like respecting any traditional cultural practices that they do have, even when going through abortion, and also providing child-friendly remedies if the procedures are delayed or denied, because sometimes obviously there is a certain time period where the child or the person or the woman has to go through abortion, and obviously there has to be sort of, you know, quick action. So obviously having that fast and quick response to helping the child out with any procedures that they need to undergo. And then step 3 in the target audiences and legal decision makers, I think the primary target I would probably aim for is maybe the Ministry of Health, because they do have power over medical regulations, abortion laws, and they can also revise any sort of reproductive health policies that could include children within the agenda of allowing them to undergo abortion. And then they can also sort of tailor everything in terms of ensuring there's inclusive and also accessible care for these young girls. And then in considering another primary target, I think the Congressional Committee on Women and Children's and Indigenous Peoples. So there's also CEDAW as well, but I feel like CEDAW is more about women. But when we're talking about young girls here, they obviously need their own sort of tailored rights, and also they need their own sort of I guess agenda in order to understand what they go through as well. So they would push for legislative reforms, considering decriminalizing abortion as well as child pregnancies, and it would also hold institutions accountable if they do let these young girls go through the pregnancy, which they obviously did not want in the first place. And then in terms of any sort of influences, I thought about maybe like the national bar associations that could give like in each country they could provide like legal clarity and also supports for any rights-based reform. So this would include getting maybe the Ministry of Health also like interlink with the National Bar Association and then have like liaise together about how they can support these young girls that go through such horrific experiences, and then which leads to being pregnant at such a young age. And then they could obviously support them in terms of their rights of getting the right medical and mental health help as well. And then obviously it is quite harder, but I feel like trying to also integrate with the youth and the Indigenous advocacy networks. Obviously they do have their own traditional customs, but I feel like it is a really essential sort of way to integrate with other communities and make them understand, these basic rights need to be accessible for all girls, no matter race, no matter religion, no matter sex as well. And then in considering the legal advocacy message, I was looking at the CRC and I was looking at Article 6, 24 and 37. And obviously they do talk about the protection of like child survivors from like rape and also abortion. So there's also a mention here where they say girls have the right to life, health and dignity under the CRC. But in this part of the article, I feel like there should be also a bit where they talk about how we shouldn't criminalize the survivors of rape, because it's not just illegal, but it's also immoral, because these girls have been through already so much, and then to go on and then criminalize their action of abortion is just completely immoral and also unrealistic as well. And then I would also call for like the Ministry of Justice again to reform the technical guide on abortion and also include young girls within it, just to sort of broaden the horizon to allow these young girls to access the correct and right medical care. And then also I feel like we should look into different country systems and their judicial systems to integrate these policies and these laws in order to have safe access for these young girls, to provide them with the correct help. And then my campaign identity, I wasn't too sure, but I went for her voice, her choice. I wasn't too sure. I just sort of, I was on top of my head, but that sort of kind of embodies how a girl should have her voice, heard, and then her choice to be solidified and integrated within the community as well as law. Yeah, that's all.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a very well done job. I love that you integrated the Camille Leversperoux that we mentioned on the first day. I don't know if you had known the case before.
Yeah, because I did the international human rights law at uni, so it was like a module, and I remember that case, so I thought about including it as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Like, it's very good to like, as Coline said, legal and be the lawyer cannot work without the advocacy that goes beyond. So like if you work in the legal sphere, it's very narrow, and you have to think that what needs to be a change. And the legal advocacy, it's such an interesting field, to be honest, because you don't understand specifically, especially if you're a law person, or if you're not involved in the field, you don't understand why are all these changes happening. Because the policymakers and deputies and MPs, they make laws, but they make it in a very sterile environment. They think, we're going to do this law, and we're going to do this article, and that's why I think it's going to be very good, but maybe in practice, you see that the socioeconomic values and the conditions of a particular people, the traits of a specific group, does interfere with the implementation of a law. And a law that can be perfect in one country can be not perfect in another one. So, and this is such a very timely issue, especially with the whole wave that's going right now. And in some cases they do think of even criminalizing the victims of rape, which is nonsensical. So thank you very much. Very, very good. Perfect. I'll also make sure that Coline access these comments, so she can also check and make a note of your assignments. But thank you. Do I have, since we have some that have submitted, can I have the other ones say on the comments who would like to speak? It's very good if you'd be able to Imogen. Is here. Okay, I'll give the floor to Imogen and then to I didn't see if it was Anna Maria. This is perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Then I have Saskia on the line. Okay, Imogen, let me put it here. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, it's also Imogen.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
It's no problem. So yeah, I went for just the campaign name, Protect Their Futures. The issue I chose was a lack of comprehensive legal protections for girls against child marriage, specifically in the UK. Why it matters. It often violates girls' basic human rights, including their right to education, health, freedom from violence. It has the potential to perpetuate cycles of poverty and gender inequality, and it often leads to early pregnancies, which obviously have their own complications as well, potential abuse, and a potential lifetime of disadvantage for these girls who get married. Child marriage takes away from a girl's life with no benefit of marriage, and no benefit of marriage can outweigh the freedom of a girl being able to enjoy her childhood. Furthermore, in the UK, deciding factor in child marriage is whether the parents consent to their child getting married, which takes away potential autonomy from those girls who still have many life experiences to live. The age should be raised to 18 so that these girls and boys who also go through the same thing upon adulthood can fully consent by their own volition. And in the interim, free and accessible legal aid should be offered to all child brides who help to help them fight for their legal rights. Campaign goal to advocate for the national enforcement of the legal marriage age of 18 to protect girls from child marriage, with a further international goal of consistent legislation across the world that establishes 18 as the minimum legal age of marriage. In the interim, give free and accessible legal aid, and then ensure registration for marriages, including all civil, religious, and customary unions, as it means that you can trace the age of marriages and prevent child marriage. Primary audiences, my main one was MPs, so that they can promote the issue or submit a bill in Parliament, and also because MPs represent their constituency, their support helps build up protection from the ground up and promote in their own constituencies. And then also the Ministry of Gender and Women's Affairs and the Ministry of Justice, secondary supporters and allies, just various NGOs working on girls' rights, local community leaders, international organizations like UNICEF, UN Women, and Amnesty International, and then legal aid groups that can help provide support for the child marriage survivors. And then for messages, I just said every girl deserves a future of opportunity and safety. We call on lawmakers to enforce the legal marriage age of 18, ensuring girls are free from the horrors of child marriage and can grow to their full potential. Child marriage is a violation of human rights and international treaties. It's time for action. We must raise the legal marriage age to 18 to safeguard girls from harm and uphold their right to a life of dignity. Hashtag end child marriage. Hashtag protect their futures.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Eugene. There is this wave, it's true, that's going on, that's calling for harmonization of 18 of the age of the child marriages to end and the age of marriage to be 18. Now, in many even European or like modern or like Western democracies, there is some places 16, 14. But and in some cases in these Western democracies, the like it's not a concept that the child marriages are usually forced marriages, for example, and how it is in my country, I would say. So I would say any marriage below 18, it's usually a forced marriage and not an not even some sort of subject of will by the girl. It's such an important cause to support and to think, because in law you know that you don't have any will of power if you don't turn 18. So it's when you go 18, you're considered an adult. You have the right to take upon obligations. So it's very important to take into consideration that even if there is some sort of will or wish in and some like consent going on, it's not consent in the way that the consent should be by the legal definition of it. So it's very interesting to see. Imogen, are you based in the UK?
Yes, yeah.
It's very, very interesting that you chose this topic. It's a very good one and amazing job with the way that you laid it down. And it's a topic, and it's like a campaign worthy of being implemented and to come in reality.
Yeah, I also think that because obviously ending child marriage across the world is such a prevalent issue, and a lot of people in the UK are advocating for it when like, at the age of 16 you're still a child, so you're still getting married as a child if you're getting married under the age of 18. So it's also about addressing the same issue that a lot of people are fighting for internationally, but in the UK as well.
No, it's very, very timely. Thank you so much. Maria, you are next, and then followed by Saskia. And Ana Maria. Oh, sorry, Maria San Miguel. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay, perfect. So my topic is female genital mutilation, specifically focused on European countries, because we usually think that it happens in like African countries or Asia, but it also keeps happening in European countries, especially with certain migrant communities and girls who have undergone female genital mutilation are often left without medical, psychological, or legal support. There is legal frameworks that are robust, but the enforcement within these communities is especially weak, and there is silence that continues happening around these issues. So my campaign focuses on targeted legal education and community outreach, which is essential to protect these girls and support the survivors. So yes, as I've said, the campaign aims to prevent female genital mutilation and support survivors through community-driven legal education by empowering girls to understand their rights, recognize risk, and seek help, and also informing families of the legal consequences and the available support there is. So the primary audience would be girls and young women in migrant communities, both survivors, but also those who are at risk of female genital mutilation. So they recognize the signs and they are able to seek help when they think that might happen to them. And then also families and community leaders who shape attitudes and decisions around female genital mutilation, especially because it is a decision that is mostly made in those spaces, in families and communities. In terms of key legal actors, it would be considering local safeguarding teams and school protection officers, child protection services and community legal clinics, municipal integration and family support services, and NGOs that are also really focused with these communities and that have also a shared culture with these communities, as they will probably be able to put more pressure or convince these families not to do female genital mutilation. The legal advocacy messages would be those three. So female genital mutilation is illegal. The girls have the right to live free from violence and fear. No tradition can override your right to safety and dignity. Know your rights. If you experience female genital mutilation or think it might happen to someone you know, there are people ready to help safely and confidentially. And families deserve support, not shame. This campaign is here to protect girls, not to punish their communities. Learn the law and prevent harm together, which is also a really important message that is not shame we're putting into the families, but we're trying to protect the girls. And the hashtags and the campaign name would be this: her body, her right, ending female genital mutilation in our communities.
Amazing.
That's my campaign.
Thank you so much, Maria. I love that each one of you that have presented today, like you're taking such core girls' human rights violations, and FGM is one of them. And you know, it's very difficult to raise a claim for FGM in an international a tribunal or entity. It's because they think it's like part of their norms and cultural and traditional. That's why it's so difficult. But thinking that if the whole global arena just raise a systemic I don't know, punches that says, yeah, it's part of your tradition, but it's not okay. It shouldn't be okay. It shouldn't, like, it's suffering, it's violence, it's denying the girl the autonomy to have autonomy on their own bodies. So it's very, very good. I really like that each one of these campaigns can be, and they are needed, and they can stand alone and perform very well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. And Saskia, let me just find yours. Let me make a thing. And if you any of you has any comments, feel free to yeah, perfect. I found it. So if any of the girls have any comments, feel free to say. It'd be good to hear each other as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, mine is sort of brief, but I decided to focus on giving a voice to disabled girls and generally women who are victims of violence. So specifically like their access to justice. So physical and mental violence toward women with disabilities is a prevalent issue, and this often goes unnoticed. According to the UN, women with disabilities are at least 3 times more likely to experience violence from their family, partners, or even caregivers, leaving them with no one to seek for refuge and guidance. This intersectional discrimination means that victims are less likely to be adequately protected by the law, and even support services, which may not be properly trained to handle disabled individuals. Therefore, these victims need a voice and they need to be seen. So for the legal advocacy goal, our campaign aims to advocate for courts, police stations, and shelters to be physically accessible, such as through sign language interpreters and Braille, by lobbying lawmakers to make this legally mandatory. It's not legally mandatory around the world, so lawmakers and the Ministry of Justice are key players to this. They have the power to make significant legal change. Whilst lawmakers can draft these laws to protect disabled women facing violence, the Ministry of Justice can oversee that these laws are effectively enforced rather than sidelined. We call for access to justice to be physically accessible by law. No individual should be barred from simply experiencing court procedure. Parliament must push for women and girls with disabilities to be explicitly included and protected under all gender-based violence laws. And the demand for the Ministry of Justice to implement mandatory training to all police officers, judges, and prosecutors on how to handle cases regarding girls and women with disabilities.
Thank you so much. As Coline said, we need to think and to mobilize and go to check the legal principles and use legal rights as tools for challenging discrimination and, as in this case, gender-based violence. And we can do that by targeting systemic barriers, and we can grant community to organize themselves. So thank you very much. It's such a good campaign idea, and it's always the intersectional of violations or of vulnerabilities that a girl can have. So you're a girl, you're let's say a girl, you're young, you're disabled, and all these layers and all those issues that maybe it's like the Venn diagram that they touch upon themselves, and then you are a person that you suffer from like layers and layers of discrimination. And sometimes maybe if a system is trying to become very good for, let's say, for victims of domestic violence, if they don't take into account that these victims cannot be just girls, but they can be disabled girls, they can be boys, they can be adults, they can be elders. So it's like everything should be into account and taking also these sections of gender, race, age, cultural norms, and everything. It's good to have that thought in mind, and thank you so much for bringing this into our attention. We have time for a couple more. I love everyone of your campaign ideas. Equal access to legal aid, Flora, that's very, very good. Anissa, online violence against women. Online violence against women is also very interesting because not many people speak about it, and many people disregard it. So if someone assaults you online and if someone stalks you online, it's not the same feeling for you as it is when it happens in real life, but it is as invasive, for example, and it can potentially be more scarring and more long lasting than someone stalking you in real life, and it can be as damaging to your trauma and to your whole support system that you have for your life. So all of these topics, and you think, okay, you disregard them and you think, yeah, they happen, but maybe they might not happen to me. There should be more advocacy going on. So all these topics are super good. Do you want me to choose one of them and do a final one, or does anyone want to speak? Coline will provide comments to each one of these, and if she has any like insights, or let me see if anyone raised a hand. Okay, I might do the last one, and I see there are two for human trafficking. There is one for child marriage, abortion policies. Yeah, Sri Lakshmi, yeah, we can close with you. That'll be perfect. Okay. And also, to let you know that this February, we are calling for the campaign to make February Girls Human Rights Month. And if any of you want to do any of these campaigns under that framework, we'd be very happy to assist. So just let me know on email and we can think. I'm just brainstorming. I'm not very sure, but we can do something online. We can do like an awareness campaign. We can do some sessions. We can do some infographics. So for whoever thinks that their campaign idea or their topic really resonates with them and they can have the time to dedicate a couple hours per week to do it, just let me know. It'd be very good to have some of these shown to other people. Okay, let me find it. Yeah, perfect. At home, at work. Yeah. Sri Lakshmi?
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, so this one is, I think, like much less impressive than some of the ones we've heard already, but it's a bit more niche. It's about like ensuring maternity leave guarantees and equality and fights the current inequality that persists. So there's a lot of like online discourse and government discourse right now about like motherhood and maternity rights, and it's honestly quite a risky time to have a child or be like looking to start a family. So that was where inspiration for this came from. So basically, as of right now, enshrined in like UK workers' protections and in like the 2010 Equality Act, there's supposed to be protections in place for people who are on maternity leave and then wrongful discrimination after maternity leave. Like if you come back and then you get made redundant because you were away, like that's technically illegal. But the thing is, these things are really hard to enforce and it's quite hard to prove. So a lot of the time, young mothers and especially like people from minority backgrounds who are working in like a fast-paced field can feel quite like disempowered to actually pursue like these legal avenues if they feel like they've been discriminated against. So that leaves people that have just given birth or have like just had another child or maybe who are now living on their own or are subject to a whole host of other like intersectional issues with a new child, that leaves them in a very vulnerable position because legal aid is expensive and it's quite hard to stand up to someone that employed you and that basically controls your way of life. So that was where this came from. The campaign name is At Home at Work, so making sure that women feel comfortable to like pursue this sort of thing. So in terms of audience and decision makers, so this would very much be a dual pronged approach because a lot of workers' rights things, they work best if you collaborate with unions and with employers, but also like there's a top down push to like hold unions and employers to account, but then also a bottom up push to make legislative change. So something that was really inspiring for this, because a lot of my work is in like the political sphere, is like how powerful private members bills can be. So for those of you who aren't familiar with like UK legislation and things like that, so a private members bill is a bill that's put forth by a lord in the House of Lords who's an expert on these things, and there are like people in the House of Lords who are quite familiar with human rights issues. So that was where I thought that could come from, because if impetus comes from there and it gets a lot of backing and it gets a lot of public backing. So something that's been in the news a lot lately is the assisted dying bill, and that started off as a private members bill, which is very unusual. So something like that could be really effective because it would show that not only is this a societal change, it's an establishment change. So people are pushing from this, like from the very highest levels of the UK government. So that's where I think it would be most effective in terms of advocacy. And also making sure that unions and employers, not that they feel attacked, but that they feel like aware that they have to be compliant to these things, because it's already such a risky decision to like grow your family. To then be worried about being unsafe is just like an unsustainable thing on top. And in terms of campaign messages, these were very like politically facing. So the first one is that women and mothers are not hindrances to the working world, because a lot of the time you have employers worrying about PAYE schemes or things like that for people on maternity leave, which is already ridiculously short in this country. So that was a key message. Message 2 was that creating another life shouldn't mean allowing your own to be destroyed. And you see a lot of this in like healthcare, where people prioritize the like child's well-being over the mother's. So we can't let that happen in the world of work because it's like categorically unfair. And the third one is that women are not protected by existing by existing legislature, which is why that this basically manifests as a human rights issue, even though it's something that we should have resolved long ago. So I think with like advocacy that's both top down and bottom up and really reaches out into the community, we can tackle that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a good topic, such a as you said, very niche. We had an occasion this on the festival in February with a lawyer that said she worked on mostly on cases related to women who were wrongfully terminated for maternity, and she was pushing this whole work on maternity regulation and the rights and everything. And she was like, I don't feel very equipped to talk about gross human rights because I don't feel like my work is a lot on this field. And we were like, what are you saying? Working for on cases related to maternity leave, it's at the core, especially in these cases, because it's such an modern way of violating the rights of women, because they see you on the face, they say that we have granted you these rights, we have granted you that you will not be wrongfully terminated, you have the right for 1 year. It depends on the legislation, you have the time to stay with your child, but it doesn't say what really happens to the women and what is the cultural discrimination that happens, that she maybe not be recruited at all because she's a woman, and because they know that she might be becoming a mother soon. Sometimes she might have, and as it was the case that Coline was saying, the bias in the ChatGPT that a woman will be granted lower paid salary, and that is really connected because studies have shown that because a woman is more inclined to take more hours for the family, she does the work and then she goes home. She doesn't go to after-hour meetings and whatever, and it becomes more discriminatory. And for example, I just heard something in Albania that a judge was returned in her position after 4 months of birthing the baby, because here in Albania it is that you get a cut and your salary becomes 80% when you have a baby and you take the maternity leave. And she was like, yeah, it's I need to work. And a judge had to imagine, like to go back to work in that time, because here it's a bit problematic, that thing. It's a very good, I really suggest you push this. Somehow it's really very, very good. Okay, so we do have the comments at the Mighty Network. Feel free to also comment on each other and mingle, and like if you see something or if you question something, it doesn't mean that you would have to comply or say you're fine with everything in all of the occasions. Okay, I think we're a bit after our time. Thank you very much to everyone who who stayed a bit late. I hope you found this session interesting. The recording is going to be on the website, and just to let you know that we already have published our recording. So this is for the first day, this was for yesterday, and today we're going to put this other day. Some housekeeping notes. So after this week, we will do the final day on Friday, and then on next week we're going to issue the certificates. I'm very thankful for your engagement. If you have any comments on how we can better improve the session, just drop me a message either on Mighty Network or on email. And yeah, I will see you tomorrow at the same time, at the same place on Zoom. And yeah, whatever there is any concerns, just let me know. Thank you, and hope you have a very good rest of the day. Goodbye.